win-win no matter what for them. They're going to get paid no matter what.
Exactly. It's poor people were money in the bank, and
Yes.
they couldn't, as you pointed out, they were happy that this building foreclosed because they would just sell it again and again and again.
Hey everybody, how you doing? Welcome back to the Another Nobody Show with me, your favorite nobody, Travis Myers. Today, we're talking to a very esteemed author and my new friend, Stacy Horn, about her newest book, The Killing Fields of East New York. It's a pretty heartbreaking story about greed and white-collar crime and how it destroys neighborhoods. But that's enough from me. Let's get with Stacy so she can explain it all. Hey everybody, how you doing? Today we have a very special guest who wrote this phenomenal book here, The Killing Fields of East New York. Her name is Stacy Horn. She's a native New Yorker, and I'm here to tell you I'm a big fan of this book. Hey Stacy, how you doing? Thanks so
Uh,
much for joining me today.
it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, wow, it's good to have you. And yes, I'm being honest when I tell you I really, really loved your book here. What you did what you did. So it is true crime, all right? But unlike so much of the true crime that's written today, it's not about serial killers and you know crazy awful people in that respect, but it's about white collar criminals who, although this happened nationwide at the time, you concentrated on the neighborhood of East New York, all right, and how these horrific, horrific criminals absolutely destroyed the neighborhood. And so, that's what we're going to talk about today, how great this book is and the stories itself. So I'll ask you about the stories. Before we get started, though, I want to tell everybody the way uh, uh, Stacy wrote this, okay? And what I really liked about it is that she wrote it almost more of a novel, although it's a true crime book, and all the facts are in there. It reads like a story. So please tell us a little bit. What turned you on? What turned you on to this case and wanted you to get started with it?
Well, uh, my book before this was Damnation Island, which was a history of Roosevelt Island
Hmm.
and all the abuses that happened there. But I was casting about for what book I would write next, and my publisher said, "Would you consider writing a true crime book?" Because true crime was really selling well at the time and
Yes.
still does. But I'm not really a true crime person, and I wasn't interested. But I had once written a book about the NYPD's Cold Case Squad, and
Hmm.
these are detectives that go back to try to solve older unsolved homicides. And in the process of researching that book, I learned that East New York, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, had the highest number of unsolved homicides in New York.
Yes.
And I never forgot that. I didn't look into it at the time, but I thought, well, maybe there's a story there. Like, why East New York? Why them? And so I started researching East New York, and I didn't know a lot about East New York at the time. I had this vague sense in my head that it was a bad neighborhood and that it always was. But when I started looking into it, I learned that it was actually a very nice neighborhood up until the 1960s. It was like a working class, middle class neighborhood that was in the process of elevating and incorporating upper middle class families. And then it tanked, and it just tanked really, really quickly.
Hmm.
So I looked into that, and I traced it back to a white collar crime that happened as a result of recent civil rights legislation. And that's the book. The book tells two stories. I follow two threads. I follow these white collar criminals, the discovery, the investigation, and the prosecution, and the decline of East New York. And I followed this one murder in particular, but I just constantly go back and forth between East New York going downhill and the investigation of these white collar criminals and the response to them. And the timelines are together for a while, but then East New York keeps going to the present day, and the white collar thread stays in the 1970s. And I did that because as New York was declining, and I'm going back and forth between the two stories, I want the reader to constantly know it's because of those guys. It's because of those guys. Is this bad things are happening? It's because of those guys. I
Yes.
wanted the reader to never forget how this all began.
And and correct me if I'm wrong, the catalyst, if you will, or the beginning, was in 1968, the Housing and Urban Development Act.
Yeah.
Is that what went through?
Yeah.
Which, in theory, many of these things when they are passed or put through, in theory, are good ideas or come off as good ideas on paper and done with people voting for things that they think are going to help underprivileged people. But they are, as almost everything that the government touches, sadly, is just ripe for corruption.
Well,
And that's kind of what unfolds here, correct?
yeah, but I look at it differently.
Okay.
I don't think it was just a good idea on paper. It was a good idea.
Oh, no, no. Well,
But
correct me. I'm not saying that it was not that it was a bad idea. The idea, the thought behind it was great. It's yes, we want to help people. This problem hasn't ended. If
yeah.
anything, it may be. The housing crisis is worse than ever now. But the fact of the matter is that um, when these things come through, sadly, like I say, it opens the door for every schemer out there and every crooked individual that can find a loophole to take advantage.
Well, that maybe I should write another book, but that's part of the problem. Uh, White collar criminals, I mean, they're in control. They have the
Absolutely.
money and the influence so that they can avoid investigation and prosecution. In fact, they have so much influence, it's hard to put laws on the book that even call what they do crimes.
Yes.
People want to leave it to it's not nice, it's unethical, but it's not a crime.
Yes.
And whereas with street crimes, every tiny little step they make, that gets labeled a crime.
Yes.
And it doesn't stop there. When those crimes are committed, there's sentencing guidelines that get harsher and harsher and harsher, where the same does not apply to white collar criminals. So even though I believe I completely show how they destroyed these neighborhoods across the United States, and they're causing terrible destructions, crime, and death. Nothing happens to them. I mean,
Well, that's almost where I think quite often they have it figured out, okay, and they get the green light, and these are people in big business, in politics, in the government itself, our elected officials, who know, well, you know what? Yeah, sure. What we're doing is wrong. We'll make $100 million. If I'm convicted, I'll have to give 10 of it back.
yeah,
So they literally,
exactly,
yeah, they're way they have it figured out. They
exactly.
know, it's just like the whole thing with we don't want to go off a whole political tangent, but big business also has it all figured out. You know, well, no matter what happens with I'll break it down very simple. Whatever happens with the gas prices jumps to $4 a gallon. So they put those gas prices right into their products that they're selling. I know this from being a small businessman myself. Now, my little delivery is got a surcharge of $15. You know, but they're surcharging 100 different customers, so they're actually making out in the end. You
Yeah.
know, and then I have to, as a businessman, raise my prices, and who pays for it in the end? The common man, the common person, the regular person trying to raise a family always pays. You know.
Yeah, but I don't think they're aware of that or they accept that.
Oh
What kills me
no.
is like when I try before I wrote this book, and we can talk about what opened my mind about financial crimes, but I would try to talk to my friends about this, about how terrible it was, and they didn't want to hear it. And I just, in the course of my research, it just all became clear to me. I mean, and especially when I wrote Damnation Island, which also covers the fact that financial criminals, white collar criminals, didn't go to jail in 19th century
Yep.
either. And it's because we've all like grown up on this narrative. There's like a million TV shows, movies, books about street criminals and murderers, and it's just like we're we we're awash in it, and it permeates everything in our popular culture. So people are used to thinking street criminals, they're all over the place, they're bad, and they're responsible for everything that's bad in the country. And there's like almost nothing out there about the white collar criminals. If they were being, had a drumbeat about the exact outcome of like money laundering, tax evasion, which they they think is such a benign crime, and everybody wants to be a tax
Sure,
evader,
sure,
but they don't see how much that hurts the entire country, that they're not paying
of
their fair
course,
share.
of course.
And so as a result, everyone's afraid of street criminals. And when they hear a story like migrants eating dogs, they'll accept that. But the idea that no, the real bad guys, the real scary guys that you should be afraid of are the white collar criminals.
Well, and we know this from our a previous conversation we've had. You know, myself, I think the big problem that we have and have always had. This is not anything new about this. Has been the it's not invisible to me, but the invisible class structure that we have in the nation here. You know, and so yes, for the common person, the regular person on the street, you're afraid of muggers, you're afraid of bad guys. You know, and you don't see the figurative gun that the politicians and big business has at your back, and the
Yeah,
power, the unbelievable power that they have, over
absolutely.
every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely. They are not aware of the crimes that are
No,
being committed
no,
against them. They do not know that they are victims of these crimes. In fact,
yeah,
when I was researching why prosecutors so rarely prosecute crimes, they point this out as a problem, that victims, that often they don't, it's hard to trace that a crime has been committed. And I try to show this in the book, because victims, don't know that they've been a victim, and they don't know who to
mhm,
complain to, or if they knew, or again, they're
yeah.
invisible. You're right, that's part of the whole problem.
They're absolutely invisible, and people, and uh, you know, we do live in America, which is an incredibly comfortable place to live, even for poor people in comparison to poor people in other countries, if you will. You know, um, but the thing of it is we're so easily satisfied with, a warm meal, something good on Netflix, a new pair of shoes. Life is great, and you don't realize, well, life is great, but if it weren't again for the powers that be, it would be so much better. You
I
know,
God, God,
housing would not be the issue that it is. Clothing, food, and now with all the nonsense chemicals and garbage we're putting into our system, and that's a whole nother book for you to write in the future. you know but there's so many things, again, because we're not wise to it, and it's
it
it's
just
heartbreaking.
breaks my heart.
Yes.
The stuff they learned. It's like we talked briefly about what was going on in the country, the legislation that led to
Hmm.
these crimes. But in the 1960s, there was a series of riots across the country, related to civil rights, where communities and people of color were just said, we're not going to take it anymore. And racism in the 1960s and earlier was genuinely horrible. It's bad now, but it was a nightmare. And so they're finally saying enough. And they were rioting across the country. And I talk about the fact that riot is really the wrong word. Like if the white community was subject to what they were subject
Hmm.
to, we'd be blowing up buildings. And, this was a rebellion. This wasn't a riot. It was, they were
Hmm.
finally saying enough. And so President Johnson at the time, put together this group, which came to be known as the Kerner Commission, to find out why people were rioting. I mean, looking back, it's like insane that he had to ask people why are they rioting, that he couldn't figure it out himself. And the Kerner Commission came back, and said, because America is a racist country.
Hmm.
And they showed how this was affecting people's lives. And they pointed out the biggest problems: employment discrimination, housing discrimination, the police. I'm sorry to say, but this was the
No, I
1960s,
understand.
different time. And so I'm really just theorizing, but it's my, and I'm not the only one to think this, but Johnson addressed housing, I think, because it was the one that he had even a prayer of being able to have a positive effect. I mean, overhauling the police departments across the country at a time when people did not recognize that police were part of the problem,
Mhm.
telling employers they have to hire blacks. I mean, that would be a big, big thing. So they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which just made housing discrimination illegal,
Mhm.
against the law. And then they followed that up with the Housing and Urban Development Act, which you mentioned. And that just put into place programs that made it easier for families of color who were never able to buy a house, or it was difficult to buy a house, to buy a house. And those are the programs that these people scammed. And the programs were good and sound and fair, and where um, they were put into place in cities where the people running them really kept on top of it and made sure that no scammer scammed it, it worked. So what breaks my heart is our country was in bad shape in the 1960s, and
Yes.
things were horribly, horribly unfair. And I'm not saying that this act would have fixed everything, but it would have been such an important first step if this
Sure, of
if
course.
people had managed it the way the guy in Minneapolis, I believe it was Minneapolis, ran it, and it was successful all over the country. We would have It would have been such an important step forward in addressing the unfairness in our country and racism in our country. And instead, it took this wonderful opportunity and made everything 1,000 times worse.
Right. And again, now something that I'm not quite clear on, but I know this a little bit from what had happened in 2007, I'm sorry, in 2008, which again was basically a mirror of what had happened 20 years prior. Um, but what did I want to say? I lost track of my own thought there. Um,
Well, they
well,
targeted the same
oh,
people.
no, absolutely. Well, before we get into the question that I wanted to ask, what you just reminded me, something that did surprise me, I did not know that the group Acorn, the organization Acorn, was actually part of the first time around, the first go around, was attached to it there. You write about, you mentioned Acorn in your book.
Yeah, tried to develop affordable housing in East
Correct,
New York.
correct. And then again, they came through a second time around in the 2007, 2008. I know they've changed their name since, but there was all kinds of ups and downs and problems with them. And again, I'm not saying as an organization, but I'm saying many members within the organization who were stealing money and using it again for their own benefit because they knew, well, again, anything that we do is always ripe for corruption, sadly. And in this particular case, uh, I'm gonna jump forward a little bit in this, where what was it? Eastern Service Corporation, all right, who are the main bad guys in your book, who are a very small cog nationwide, but it was one that you concentrated on. Again, were able to push these loans to people who, some who should absolutely not have been able to get a loan, got loans. They were selling homes that should not have been sold to begin with, would never have passed inspection. And I could tell you a personal story on that with the property that I once bought. And again, in the mid 2000s. Um, and really turned this into just the. I hate to sound like I am happy with what they did, but they were brilliant people, these bad guys. The way that they figured it out and made it work, it was just bang, 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 loan after loan after loan after loan, which decimated East New York.
I don't know that they're particularly brilliant. The crime was there for the taking.
Well, brilliant in that they put it into action. Understand me when I say this, is that they're not good. I'm not saying that in any way, but the way that they
No,
were
I know
able
you're
to
not. I know
maneuver
you're
it.
not. You don't.
No, I
You're
mean,
you're just acknowledging that they figured something out. But
again,
what
I've locked up many bad guys, and but I do understand where they come from, and that they're able to create these empires of crime. And how many millions did they actually defraud you?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think racism again had a lot to do with it because since the 1930s, the government has been helping working class and middle class people buy homes.
Yes.
But until they included families of color,
Hmm.
those scams were always there to be had. But when it was white families, they were not targeted.
Hmm. Well, but we did not have that particular uh, act that came through in '68, though, to put it into a program that way, did we?
True,
I mean,
but we were
it was
still helping.
almost, and I'm believe me, I'm not arguing with you at all, but it was almost like we handed a package. We, as in the government, not you and I, we handed the bad guys a package. We built the package for them to take advantage of. They should not have, and when caught, they should have been hammered for it. But in fact, again, it was just too easy for them to get over. As again, the same thing that happened to us in 2008.
But I'm saying that there were similar programs that were
Mhm.
established in the 30s.
Right.
They were updated to include families of color,
Hmm.
and they made changes that actually benefited all families,
Yes.
like longer times to pay off the loans, lower mortgage rates. They, I'm just saying, white families could have been scammed in the exact same way
Hmm.
before this, but they weren't.
They weren't. They weren't targeted the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
So we were talking. Something popped up when you were talking before, but I wrote this book about Roosevelt Island
yes.
in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, Roosevelt Island was called Blackwell's Island,
Yes.
and it was owned by the city of New York. And they used it to build replacement institutions that existed in Manhattan, but were terrible. Like there was a
Hmm.
lunatic asylum, a home for the poor, and two prisons, and they were just being very badly run. So they bought Roosevelt Island. They were going to build new institutions and fix all the mistakes and all the problems that existed in Manhattan. But things just went south almost immediately. But the reason I'm bringing this up is they had two prisons called one was the penitentiary for people who were convicted of felons, and the workhouse for people who were convicted of misdemeanors.
Yes.
And it was run by the Department of Correction and Public Charities, which are now separate groups, but they weren't in the 19th century. So they produce these annual reports every year to talk about, how they were managing their institutions. And as you know, the people who run prisons are, not always the most um, compassionate people in the world.
No, they're not. and
So
historically never have been. So.
so it was interesting to me that when I was reading these annual reports, that one prison warden wrote in an annual report for anyone to read, and I'm paraphrasing. He said, I can't help but noticing that you never send wealthy prisoners to me, and we all know
Hmm.
wealthy people commit crimes too.
That's
So
right.
what's up with that? And he said outright, he said, it tells me that they can buy their way out of going to prison.
Absolutely.
And so I started looking into that, and there's this organization which I believe still exists today, the Women's Prison Association.
Hmm.
So they went to all the courthouses and just sat and watched what happened, and then wrote reports of what they
Hmm.
saw. And what they saw, and they said, if wealthy people come in at all, and they very rarely get arrested and brought to court and arraigned, the judge immediately either dismisses them or
Hmm.
just gives them a small fine and sends them on the way. Whereas the poor people, when when they commit a crime, they're brought in. They're not allowed to bring witnesses or talk in their defense.
Hmm.
They get fined $500, which at that time was like an enormous fee that
Sure.
none
Yes.
of them could possibly pay, and they get shipped off to the workhouse and the
Yep.
penitentiary at Blackwell's Island.
And this has been throughout history. Throughout history. I mean, and even today, if a wealthy person is convicted, which is very unlikely, but they have nicer prisons that they can go to. You
Exactly.
know.
Yeah.
if you end up, thank God, the only prison I've ever been in, well, been to, let me rephrase that, is Rikers Island, but not as a prisoner, as a police officer. Okay, and I would recommend that nobody ever visit if possible.
Yeah.
Um, but from what I understand, going to Otisville, in New York, which is a federal penitentiary, it would probably be equivalent to a vacation for you or I, you know, and they have tennis courts and they eat nice meals and they have all kinds of crafts and things to do, and it's not prison like in the least, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
um and then we have the case, what was that one, geez, I'm sure you remember it because it was all over the news, with that idiot mother and son, where the judge let the boy off and called it affluenza. You remember that
I
case?
do remember
Yes.
that.
Yes, and he let the boy off. It was a DWI, drunk driving accident thing, and they let the boy off for that. And of course, he ended up reoffending and reoffending, and they ran to Mexico to try to hide from the police and got in trouble. But again, you know, different rules.
Well, that's how uh, that I want to tell just a brief story. So I wrote this book about the police department's cold case squad, and I spent a couple of years researching unsolved murder and
Mhm.
trying to educate myself as to why, who gets murdered and whose murders get solved and whose murders don't get solved, and why is that. And I was able to learn a lot. I mean, there's just so much information out there. The FBI has reports, the Department of Justice has reports. I could go to any city, any
Mhm.
town in America and learn how many people have been murdered there and how many cold cases there are. There's just a lot of information. So when my book came out, there was a very famous white collar criminal who had just been, or who was being investigated or just been convicted, and I can't remember who it was. And I just thought, oh my god, that's interesting. I wonder. I didn't know anything about white collar crime, and I just said, I wonder how many white collar criminals go to jail, how many are being investigated, how many are prosecuted. How bad is white collar crime? I just didn't know. So I called up every group or department that I could think of that investigates white collar crime. So I called the SEC, I called the Department of Justice, I called DAs, I called U.S. attorneys, just everyone I could think of. And I just asked basic questions like, how much white collar crime is out there? How much white collar crime is there in your jurisdiction? How many cases are you investigating? How many cases have you prosecuted? How many people? I just started asking a question. And down the line, and at this point I was writing an op-ed for the New York Times about it. So down the line, I was told, we don't know. We don't
They
know.
don't bother.
We don't have a database.
They don't
And
bother.
it wasn't like they didn't want to answer the question, because telling me that was bad. Like if they were trying to not look bad, they knew that that was bad.
Yes.
And I just thought, oh my God, like, so, so we don't know like how much white collar crime is out there, but we also don't know how good a job any of these people are doing, because we
Yes.
don't know how many cases they're working on. We don't know how many cases they've actually brought to conviction, and we don't know anything. It could be rampant, it could be nothing. We just don't know. And I wrote an op-ed about that. And that is still the case. There was like a brief period where the FBI looked like it was starting to keep track, and I think they did publish a few reports. But for this book, I revisited that to see if we improved, and we haven't.
We
And
have
the
it.
FBI now does less.
And that doesn't surprise me at all. And in fact, I will to step back a little bit, come at it from the whole different angle, because again, in my experience as a New York City police officer and detective in the Bronx, you know, the Bronx, I always call it the lost borough because nobody ever cared what happened there. And for decades, I've been, well, not me, all of us who live in this world, in the crime, the true crime world, you know, um, horrific things happen every day in places like the Bronx, all over the Bronx, all over Brooklyn. Of course, we're talking today about the 7-5 precinct, for those who don't know what we're talking about, in East New York, which has always been, well, in our lifetime, has always been a rough area, you know? And Um, but I remember, why are these cases never in the news? They're never in the news. Murders, rapes, kidnapping, serial killings, serial rapists with cool, catchy names that we named them in the police department for the cases, and it doesn't make the newspapers. The news, the Post, New York Times, they don't care. Doesn't rate, you know. But somebody stubs their toe in Central Park, it's going to be all over the place. You know, it's going to be a big deal. You know, I remember, I want to say it was New York Magazine. I could be wrong. Did a piece in the '90s. I know I was still working at the time, and I was, I'm sorry to say, thrilled with the piece. I was not happy with what was going on, but they did 9 homicides that happened in 1 week within the borough of the Bronx, and not one of them had ever made the news. 9 homicides in 1 week. Not one had ever made the news. And so they did a, 2 or 3 page spread on these 9 people that were killed. Again, just to show that nobody cares.
I that
Nobody
was
cares.
something I learned when I wrote The Restless Sleep. Like I had I was able to look at a printout of all the unsolved homicides in New York and all the boroughs, and so I started looking into it and for media about these crimes, and I learned just what you learn: Manhattan murders in all the papers,
Yes.
uh, Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, almost never get mentioned. It was horrible. And when I wrote this book about East New York and I was looking for any press attention for all these East New York murders where they had the highest number,
Yes.
almost nothing. But everybody I interviewed for The Rest of Sleep just straight out told me the truth about that they said, and so the highest number of unsolved cases are outside of Manhattan. They're in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens.
Yes.
And so the police, the I talked to Lou Anamone,
Hmm.
and they just straight up said, if somebody gets murdered in Manhattan, we're on it. We
Hmm.
have to solve that. Outside, no, there's not as much pressure to
And
solve those
it
cases.
all comes down to politics, and again, back to class, because, and funny enough, back to class. So when something does happen on the Upper West Side, on the Upper East Side, and at Greenwich Village, a very nice neighborhood, politically, again, all the wealthy people are upset. And so they put in the phone calls. They
Yeah,
want action. They want to, and these people also quite often not the ones that are on the street anyway, even in their own neighborhoods.
yeah.
They have fairly insular lives, you know, but fear is in their heart, and so they make the complaints. They want to know something's being done. They get a small support group, even though they're not victims at all. you know they get a group together, and they hit City Hall, and City Hall does something about it, where people, again, in East New York, or the Bronx, or we can name all the different neighborhoods, have very, very little support, except for you know the maybe 6 to 12 detectives that they have working in the squad. And something I'll do, and when I do this, this is not a defense of police work. It's the reality of police work, which is a different thing. Okay, so I know we talk a lot in the killing fields here about how many cold cases there were, and how they went cold, and how they all received exceptional clearance, et cetera, et cetera. When you're working in a busy house, there are um, houses. I don't know if they still do this, because they do change things politically, even in the borough sometimes, because they don't like certain things. But we used to have them. We used to call them A houses, B houses, and C houses.
I
So
think I mentioned that in the book.
you very well may have. You put so
What's
much
his
good stuff in
name?
this book. I
I think it
loved
was
it.
Timony that created that
Jiminy, it could have
ABC
been.
houses.
It could have been.
I interviewed him. He took credit for it, I
Okay,
think.
there you go. um,
But
but
yeah, I know about that. Go ahead,
so
finish.
now, but just put yourself in a spot now. So here you are, could be a phenomenal detective, great detective, caring detective, heart of gold detective, and you're sitting in the squad. Okay, be it, again, any A house you choose. You could literally have 100 cases on your desk.
Yeah.
Now they're not all homicides. The homicides are the big ones, but you have your homicides, your rapes, your domestic violence. I mean, everything down to a small larceny. If it's his name perp, that's the way it goes. It goes to the detective, and he has to answer for it. He has to answer it, and it'll be sitting there, and you'll hit it as hard as you can, and just kind of like that TV show that they have out, the first 48. You got yourself the first 4 or 5 days that you're really everything goes into this homicide, and you work it, and you work it, and you work it, and you work it, and nothing, 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 and then you have to also understand in neighborhoods like this where the old, snitches get stitches. People don't want a rat. Even in my neighborhood, growing up in Yorkville, we never hollered cop. Never. It was a street kid thing to do. You did not talk to the police because you didn't want to be a rat. It was just that simple. So it really takes a lot of work. And remember back then there were no computers either, you know? So you're working it, working it, working it, and then bang, you get another one. And now you got another one. And now you got another one. And yes, it's me and you. We're partners, and we have, again, 4 or 6 other people in the squad to help us, but they each got 100 cases of their own, So what happens, shamefully, is that they're closed.
Yeah.
They're closed. They go
I
cold.
I am sympathetic to that, and I talked about it in the book.
Oh, you do?
Like
No.
I
This
talk
is
about
more
the,
for our listeners who
yeah.
who have no idea. It's not that the police don't care as individuals, but where are you going to go with it? Where can I go with it now? Because this new one came in. This new woman was just killed. This new child just went missing. I have to attend. I have to attend to this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, old case. You're
No,
going on the
I know.
bottom.
I know.
You
It
know.
just keeps the piles keep going higher, and you've got, a boss saying, "Hey, if you're not going to solve this, move on."
Yep.
No,
Exactly.
I'm
Exactly.
sympathetic to that. I wish I'd written more about the fact that, I had talked about just the NYPD was not prepared for what happened, and they were the only ones seemed to take at least any response. Like these neighborhoods were tanking, over very short periods of time, like a
Yes.
couple of years.
Yes.
I mean, it's shocking how little time it took to destroy a neighborhood.
Mhm.
And so the neighborhood went down, crime went up, and the NYPD is one thing that needed to be done to fix
Yeah.
it. But the problems weren't just that, there were many problems that they needed to throw people and departments at. It wasn't going to be fixed by arresting a ton of people. I mean, the
No,
problems,
not at
yeah,
all.
in healthcare and housing and education, all those things had to be addressed. All those things were tanking too.
Yes. Well, even when it comes to violence and the destruction of neighborhoods, okay? And now I know you're a nice lady. I can tell, I am assuming that you probably didn't do, even though you may remember it because you may have driven through with your family or gone from time to time, you know, so many of these neighborhoods, they were left in rubble.
Yeah,
Come the end of the 70s, right through the 80s, they were rubble. There was nothing left. I
yeah,
mean, I remember even in Manhattan being like down on the Lower East Side where you could walk down, I don't know, let's say 5th Street, and you look over and you're looking at 6th Street because there's nothing there but piles
yeah,
of bricks. It was
yeah.
all gone. Okay? And for us, and again, I don't want to keep sounding like I'm defending the police because there's nothing to defend. It was the world as it was. But we are sadly always the lowest rung on the ladder, okay? When it comes to fixing anything. The police are there because now the violence has occurred. It's a reactionary force.
Yeah.
So you have the poverty, and of course, the poverty brings and or facilitates more drugs, which degrades everything because you know yourself living in New York City. If God forbid you have one bad apartment in your building, you're built, and obviously not a doorman building, but if you live in a regular tenement building, a 10, 20 family building, one bad apartment, the building goes to shit because you have every idiot walking in and out of there. Now you end up with two bad buildings on the block. Your building is now gone. Just keep doing that again and again and again. And that's exactly what happened to East New York. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, but what you're saying, actually, that was something that I didn't know about and learned in the course of researching it. Like it. like I just mentioned, how quickly it happened to
Yeah.
tank a neighborhood.
Yes.
But it begins with the buildings. Like it's
Hmm.
very easy to take a decent building and crash it. Like, and this one guy who was testifying to Congress said, he goes, you just, he said exactly what you just said, and it makes sense. He says, you put a few criminals in a building, you've got a crime wave,
Yes.
which just spreads throughout the building. And now a nice building is now a scary building, and it
Yes.
happens very quickly.
Very quickly. And then you have your problems with well, the degradation of the neighborhood and white flight. But again, these neighborhoods, for the most part, are poorer. Back to the class thing, they are poorer white neighborhoods. These are not wealthy neighborhoods again. So you have poorer white neighborhoods, and it'll begin with, with racism and or with whatever. Quite often, in the beginning, in the very beginning, when neighborhoods become, I guess, shall we say, fringe, to make it more, visible, to your mind, when a neighborhood begins to change, it is better people in general, people who could afford homes, people who can afford better apartments move in, et cetera, right? And then through, I know you write about it, and help me out with the term blockbusting, you
Yeah.
know, the the I can't think of a better word than bad guys will come in, okay, and be like, listen, you better sell your house now. The neighborhood is going, it's falling apart. You better take off. And so it starts to change. And I've been in blocks, well, all over the city, but I'll relate it again to the Bronx when I worked back in the 90s. And there would be homes, Stacy, the most beautiful homes you ever saw on these crack blocks, you know, because the building on the corner went bad, the building on the other corner went bad, and now a home that would literally sell for $1 million in Manhattan, you can't get 40 grand for in the Bronx,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they're beautiful single family
Yeah.
homes, you know, but it degrades and degrades and degrades, and then of course with all of the violence that comes with it, now you're living in a war zone. They
Yeah.
roll up the sidewalks at night. There's no more social life. All the businesses are gone. It just gets eaten up because
Yeah.
every time one murder occurs, the best, and this is regardless of race, and this is just a fact, the best 5 or 10 families in that neighborhood will move.
Yeah.
Okay, and then of course one murder only begets two murders, and then four murders. It's the old I told two friends who told two friends who told two friends, and now you're having 60 homicides, 100 homicides a year in your precinct. Everybody that has the ability to leave will leave. You know,
And that's where racism comes in, because even
sure,
families of color with money are trapped there because there's no place else to go that they can
well,
afford and that they are welcome in.
yes, and it's just and then what happens also, if you remember back to the 70s and 80s when uh, the landlords would just burn their buildings themselves for the insurance money because they threw their hands up in the air. They weren't going to deal with it anymore, you know. And it's such a tragic, and it's happened decade after decade. It'll happen, then it'll dissipate, then it'll come back again. You know.
Well,
Awful.
I'm setting up a Zoom call with the FBI people and the prosecutors I wrote about to just talk about when is this going to happen again? Because it seems to happen like every 20, 25 years. So
Mhm.
we're due.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely, and it's again, I've often thought too. So I fooled around a little bit with real estate once I first retired. Okay, and small thing. I have I bought my very first house. I lived in an apartment till I was 35, 36 years old. We wanted to do the same, working man's thing and get our kids out of the city and get a house. We bought a little broken down haunted house up in Brewster, New York, which we fixed up, and it doubled in value and all that beautiful stuff. Great for us, right?
Was it really haunted?
No, no, no. When I say, well, my wife would say yes. I don't believe in haunted house. I don't believe in ghosts myself. But it was just a one. If you were to look at it from the outside, you would say, who in their right mind would buy that house? But it's what a young police officer and his wife can afford,
Yeah.
And so we bought it. But because we fixed it up, it doubled in value, which was great. And of course, the economy changed as it always does. But I have found doing this, okay, over the years that there seems to be a 15 to 20-year cycle just in the real estate market itself, where it gets to be impossible to buy anything. The bottom kind of falls out, which it did before the 2008 thing. It seemed to happen again. I can't remember what year I want to put on that, but in the 90s, or the end of the 80s, early 90s, there was also a collapse, and then all of a sudden people could buy houses again. Where it fell out because we were lucky. We got in on the cheaper end of it before it went berserk again. You
Mm-hmm.
know, and I think right now, as we all know, there's nothing to buy. There's no place to rent. It's impossible. I'm sure it's going to be collapsing again soon. Will it collapse the way it did in 2008? I don't think so, because I think we're a little bit wiser. But I bet 10 to 15 years down the road, it's going to happen again, and it'll be twice as hard. I can almost guarantee it. And I don't know if the powers that be, the guys holding the strings, plan it this way, but it certainly seems to work. And if you look back, every 15 to 20 years, exactly as you said, there's a collapse.
Well, that means we're due now.
Yes, yes.
And we have a current administration that is not at all going to start heavy white collar prosecutions.
No,
They're
well,
doing the exact opposite.
that was never going to happen anyway. That's such a, again, back to the class thing. I think that they live. There is a, you know, to quote the popular current vernacular, an elitist world that you and I are not privy to at all, where they completely live in a world of their own. You know.
Well, I have to point out when there was a lack of prosecutions in the 2007 2008 financial
Mhm.
crisis, that was under Obama's watch. It was his administration that
Yes.
did not prosecute.
Yes. Well, again, that's what I'm saying. They have their own private club that we don't understand. But let's talk about this book again now. So it was, um, again, I know I just mentioned their names. I can't remember. Shame on me.
It's okay.
Some of the worst characters, the Bernsteins, Harry, Rose, and Louis, okay, and Florence Behar, right? Who, for the most part, they seem to have the lockdown on East New York, right? Along with what was her name? Capracci? Am I saying that correct?
Yeah. Well, she was deceased, so I couldn't verify how. But I think it's Kapraki. That's how the
Capracci.
guys who
Yes.
prosecuted. Yeah. Eastern Service was the largest mortgage bank on the East Coast at the time,
Right.
so they weren't tiny potatoes. Um, they focused on Eastern Service and three other banks at the time, but Tony Aceta, the prosecutor, fully intended to go after many more. I mean, what there was this feeling that everyone was doing it, and everyone was like there were,
Yes.
you know, small single real estate, operations were doing it to all the way up to Eastern Service. And again, this is nationwide. I just talked about East New York. So he had planned to prosecute them all, but at a certain point, the powers that be, enough is enough. We're moving on.
Yeah. Well, again,
And
it
I,
just becomes too
I
expensive.
excuse me.
I'm sure it becomes too expensive, and it's the same thing. I don't want to say the same thing in any bit, but they have 100 cases on their desk, and they're going to prosecute two or three of them.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I wondered about that. Like, why are there so few prosecutions and like a bank, like I'm not going to name names, but there are banks that are found to be money laundering for drug lords,
Yes.
and so
All the time.
instead of going to jail, they get fined,
Yes.
and then they have to sign these consented degrees that we're not going to do it again. Here's how we're improving,
Hmm.
and yet the people that are going to oversee the fact that they are, whether or not they are following what they agree to, are themselves. They're the ones that are policing themselves. So of course they're not going to turn themselves in.
No,
And
of
so
course
they
not.
get caught again and again, money laundering again and again, and they just get fined again and again. It's just mind blowing. And now I forget where I was going with this. So I was like, how did we get here? And so I read a bunch of books. One of them that I loved was the Chicken Shit Club. I forget who wrote that, but he he did a very good job of explaining what it's like from the inside and the pressures that they get and why they make the deals that they dealt and how they lost the will to go after these guys. Like when I interviewed Tony and the people that he worked with, this was the late 60s, early 70s, and it was a different world. They were more like, let's get them. Whereas now it's like, okay, what kind of fine can we get and what kind of agreement can we make with them, and instead of going to trial.
Yeah. Well, it's come down to I think to where it is all built into the recipe. We're going to steal $100 million, and if we get caught, and I think they even think we will get caught, but by the time we get caught, we'll pay the $10 million fine. You
Yeah,
know.
but the Department of Justice went hand in hand in creating that recipe.
Oh, I agree. No,
Yeah.
I agree 100%. Absolutely. And on this note, you know what? Let's take a break for 1 second. Okay? We'll take a break, everybody, and we're going to come back and talk more about this awesome, awesome book, The Killing Fields of East New York, with my new friend, Stacy Horn. Hey, how you doing? It's me again, another nobody, Travis Myers. And today we're going to talk whiskey. I know most of you think of me as an all-American patriotic type guy, and you are right. But when it comes to whiskey and drinking whiskey, which I do, I always go for the Irish stuff. And my choice when it comes to the Irish stuff is Powers Irish Whiskey. Established back in 1791, it's a triple distilled, oak-aged whiskey. Powers is simply magic. It also happens to be the #1 selling whiskey in Ireland, which has got to say something, because if it's good enough for the Irish, it's good enough for you. So the next time you raise a glass, fill it with Powers, and think of me, another nobody, Travis Myers. Hey there, true crime fans. Let me introduce you today to the Cold Case Initiative. The Cold Case Initiative is a foundation that donates money to smaller police agencies all over the country. It does this in order to offset the costs of scientific, forensic, and DNA testing, with the hope of solving cold case homicides and other horrific violent crimes that otherwise would remain unsolved. Please, if you have it in your heart and a little money to spare, go to www.coldcaseinitiative.org. Again, that's www.coldcaseinitiative.org, and lend a hand where it truly is needed. Be a part of solving a cold case. Every little bit helps. Know that 100% of the donations that go to the Cold Case Initiative go to agencies that are desperately in need of the help. So please, if you can, do the right thing and make a donation. Thanks, and all the best, my friends. Hey, everybody, welcome back. And I'm still here with the author, Stacy Horn, talking about her awesome book, The Killing Fields of East New York. And we talked about a lot of stuff already, Stacy. But what you mentioned our friend Tony Aceta. And I'd like to talk to him about him a little bit, because I really kind of identified with him. Again, this is true crime, but he kind of came off as a hero to me in your story, because I identify with him. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to get the bad guys, and he did. But of course, he did, having to just to go through hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. Can you tell us a little bit more about Tony?
I will. I just realized, though, to tell Tony's story, I just want to just go a little bit
Oh, please, please.
backwards. But East New York started to go downhill because of blockbusting and redlining, and you already brought that up. Like
Yes.
I think of it as three crime waves. The first crime wave was blockbusting, where they would scare people out of their homes and then sell them at inflated prices to others. Once so and mostly they were selling the people that were moving in were families of color because the white people were fleeing.
Yes.
um, and once a neighborhood became primarily a black and Hispanic neighborhood, banks would redline them and not give mortgages and financial assistance to the families within. um, and then so that was the second crime wave, and then the third was the FHA scandal that I write about. And the first person to uncover that this was so this is a perfect case where people didn't know crimes were being committed. People were being sold homes, and that they had been told that the government had inspected and said was, all everything was in order, the boiler works, the electricity works, and none of that turned out to be true. So, but they didn't know, like, that they had been a victim of a crime. Like, they didn't know, like, oh, I can report them for this. They just didn't know. So the first person discovered that a crime that was happening was the Secretary of New York State, John P. Lomenzo. And he had a team of investigators that were investigating what he thought was blockbusting, which had become a crime when the 1968 civil rights legislation passed. So he thought they were just investigating a typical blockbusting case. And it turned out that this family, who had no source of income, had just bought a home for, I think, $28,000, which was a lot of money in 1968. And they started looking, and they found more cases of families that had bought home with no income. And they knew about the civil rights legislation. They knew that it was making it easy for low-income families to buy homes, but not no-income families. Like, how did they get a mortgage for a $28,000 house?
Well, I have heard of this, and I don't know if you use this term in your book, but I've in other things I've read, because I do read other things. They're often called liar loans,
Yes.
where basically it's a fictitious loan meant to fail. It's the entire process is meant to fail so that they can resell the home again and again. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, that is one of the forms that this took, but it took other forms as well. But
Yeah.
yes, that is one of the forms it took. So he looked into that, and he brought all these people in, and he realized that this was kind of a thing that was happening now. And since it involved these federal programs, it was not in his jurisdiction. So he went to the U.S. attorney, I think it was Ed Neer at the time, and said, I have evidence of these crimes. And he gave him all the evidence, and Neer said, oh my God, yes, something is going on here. This is organized. This isn't just a,
Sure.
a thing here. So he assigned it to a U.S. attorney, an assistant U.S. attorney, and it just languished. I forget for how long, for at least a year or two. And then it eventually got assigned to Tony Aceta. And he was the first person to look at this and get angry and to take it on and, like, I'm gonna get these bad guys. So he was a hero, as were the people who helped him, like Jim Snagaki was the FBI lead investigator for the Eastern Service case. Different FBI special agents were assigned to different banks, and Snagaki got Eastern Service. And he uncovered leads. He uncovered people willing to talk to him and point out. Tony says the way you solve these cases, that you start, and this is not new, but you start at the bottom and scare those people who have done a little thing wrong to
Sure.
point upwards, and you just keep climbing that ladder until you get to the
It's
top.
exactly what we do with drug dealers.
And
You start off with the buyer and get into the seller, and then you want to get the bigger seller. It's the same techniques, same idea.
well, it's the same way these people could be caught now, but it's very hard to do. First of all, you have to have knowledgeable agents about financial crimes. You have to get someone on the inside. You have to turn these people, which takes time. It's a slow, careful effort. You could put people in the inside and have, what is that called? I forget. What's the name of the people that undercover? Yeah.
Undercover, yeah.
You could have undercover white collar investigators. But again, that takes time and effort, which
And a
nobody's going to put it.
tremendous amount of money
Yeah.
that people don't ever want to let go.
Yeah, but look at what we're spending on street crime.
Oh
We're
no,
spending a tremendous amount of money. It's
believe me,
there.
it's there. I understand, but it's just the fact that people still have to write those checks. And I could tell you stories of operations that were ended where I had a district attorney on recently, and they had a great thing that they were doing, but the money was so limited they had to end it. They were buying stolen cars and locking up the people that were stealing the cars. Very simple stuff. However, they just didn't have the money to continue, and it was working like a charm. But you can only ask for so many thousands of dollars until they say you're done.
Yeah.
You know, and it is a shame. It really is. So
Yeah.
now it's talking about money again too. With the bad guys here, it was almost foolproof for them because while they are giving these loans to people that they know could never afford to pay them back for houses that should not have been sold to begin with, they're all what? Federally insured. So
Exactly.
it's win-win no matter what for them. They're going to get paid no matter what.
Exactly. It's poor people were money in the bank, and
Yes.
they couldn't, as you pointed out, they were happy that this building foreclosed because they would just sell it again and again and again.
Yep.
And I also learned that a lot of the time people didn't even know they would target immigrants who did not speak English, and they
Sure.
thought they were just signing a rental agreement and were unaware they had just bought a house.
Wow. Imagine that. Imagine that. No, it's so ridiculous. But yeah, Tony Aceta, I loved him in the book. I really did. You
Oh,
know.
good. I'm going to tell him you said that.
Yes, yes. He was like I say, if it was a film, he'd be the hero for sure. You
I'm
know.
so glad. I'm so glad I got to tell this story. Like when it happened, there was, press attention, but not enough. And not enough for the actual people that worked the case. Like Tony at least got mentioned from time to time, but again, not enough. But the FBI guys, they got mentioned not at all. If they were in one of the pictures in the paper, it would just say FBI agent escorting,
Well, back to what we were talking about, whatever, a half an hour ago. Um, it does come down to what the news is going to find interest. What's going to sell papers? What do we call it now? Clickbait, you know. And since people do understand, it's the old "if it bleeds, it leads," you know. So here, these people, are stealing tens, hundreds of millions of dollars nationwide are being stolen. Okay, crushing neighborhoods, not just East New York, all over the
oh
country
yeah,
they
yeah,
were
yeah,
doing
yeah,
this,
yeah.
all over the country, okay? Destroying neighborhoods, just raking in the money with little to no chance of being caught, little to no chance of being prosecuted, and if prosecuted, again, they're going to pay a fine. How many people but all of that being gone, the headline is still going to be a mugging on 77th Street. That's what the headline's going to be. This is going to be buried on page 6. Nobody's going to see it. But talking about convictions, um, I know there were dozens, but you said there were quite a few convictions nationwide for this case. How many?
Oh no,
What we cover?
there were 70 just in New York
Just
alone.
in New York, 70.
And
Okay.
I don't have the figures in my head, but the I think Detroit had the most convictions of all.
Hmm.
I think Detroit was the one that was worst hit
Right.
with this crime. But
And there's a city that still hasn't recovered yet.
well, I looked at all the cities that were hit the worst, neighborhoods in Philadelphia, in California, and all the ones that were hit are still suffering today
Yes.
because the problems that happened, like when I talk about the lack of reaction to the problem, and instead of throwing more money at it in East New York, the city of New York retreated and took out money, and that happened everywhere. So again, these neighborhoods are still suffering
Hmm.
because the same problems exist and the same lack of reaction
Yes.
to this problem exists. But I wanted, it's something that you said made me want to just tell briefly, like selling this story was hard. Like trying to, I and I laugh because even the people I wrote about, like Tony,
Hmm.
when I said I'm going to write a book about a 50-year-old mortgage case and it's going to be really exciting. And Tony, who lived it, was like, well, good luck. But
Well,
I think I pulled it off.
I think you pulled it off, and that's why I'm talking to you right now. And again, what I had really liked about how you did it here, though, is, and you know what? I'm so sorry I can't remember all of the names because,
I can't either, so don't
well,
worry.
one thing I loved, you have both audio and a written book, obviously, and I have, as you see, the hardcover here. But I listened to the audio because I've never read more in my life than I do now that I started this podcast, right? And so many things I wanted to get through. I was like, oh, she's got it on audio. I have to listen that way. But when I got it, you have, let me see, I'm going to open this up for our viewers here. I know our listeners can't hear, but our viewers can hear. You have, I counted them, the cast of characters,
Oh,
okay?
yeah.
And there are, I want to say, 74 names I counted in here. 74 names. That's quite a list of characters, and of course that has nothing to do with the reality of it, which were thousands of people. But what hit home with this, and what I think readers are going to like too, not only did you write it as a story that has a novel esque feel to it, but we start off with real people who are literally losing their lives because of violence and because of drugs and because of the destruction of their neighborhood. Okay, and it's it's done in a way, that gives empathy to what's actually happening and shows the true crime of, it's not stealing money. Yes, they're stealing money. They're larcenists. They're fraudsters. They're rotten people who are stealing money. Okay? But the ramifications of their actions have literally, I mean, destroyed thousands of lives. Thousands.
Yeah,
Till
well,
today. That's what people don't understand either. This may have happened in 1970, let's say, when it really kicked off, but here we are in 2025, and we're still feeling the effects of what these evil bastards did back then, 50 years ago. I'm sorry,
well,
go ahead.
like when I was first trying to sell the book, I said I'm going to tie these white collar crimes to the rise in murder and
Mm-hmm.
unsolved murders in East New York, and people said, "How are mortgage bankers responsible for these murders?"
They are.
And I show exactly how, and I painfully lay it out step
Mm-hmm.
by step how it happens, and I'm going to say it briefly here, but the foreclosures led to abandoned buildings
Yes.
because once there's a foreclosure, the FHA demanded that the building be emptied of people.
Mm-hmm.
So the banks would foreclose, evict everyone, put tin up on the windows and these buildings and just leave them. And and there were a lot of them that started out with hundreds of them, then thousands of them.
Yes.
I have account after account where in fact this one law enforcement guy posted that they used to drive through East New York and all, so the buildings would be emptied and tin put on the windows, and so kids would break in
Sure.
and party, and
I
maybe
was
they
one of those kids.
exactly
I
me
was one of those
too,
kids.
me
When I
too.
was a, when I was a kid growing up on First Avenue as a teenager, we had a building on 85th Street that was our clubhouse. All the guys I hung out with, we had our own clubhouse. It was us. I mean, not to sound tougher, we defended it. This was our place. And that's where we did all of our drinking and partying and listen to music and smoke joints.
Exactly.
This was
And
our place.
and they would vandalize it, and not in the evil way. That's just kids, what kids do. They'd
Yes,
break
yes, yes.
windows, leave the water
Mhm,
running, maybe it would warp the floor, and so
mhm.
these buildings would essentially slowly get destroyed, and then
Yes.
criminals moved in, and it would be a scene of crime for drugs, for rapes, for murder.
Yep.
And eventually a fire would start in one of these buildings, and so they started burning down one by one, so abandoned buildings became empty lots, and the only thing that was left standing were the chimneys. And this law enforcement guy said you used to drive through East New York and you go through one block after another where it was just a bunch of chimneys, and we called it the East New York National Forest.
Yes.
So what I showed was, the foreclosures led to abandoned buildings, led to the rise in crime and the destruction of East New York. At the same time this was happening, the city was not picking up the garbage, was reducing money in education and healthcare, and that's how it happens. But I'm telling it like in very broad strokes. So it may not be convincing what I'm saying right now, but I show exactly what happened. Like
Well,
when money was taken out. At one point, the neighborhood sued the FHA for their requirement that the buildings become vacant. They say that, amplified the problem.
Hmm.
And the as HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, where the FHA was part of HUD, as they were defending themselves in court against this claim, in their own, like, they had a publication, I forget what it was called, but in their own in-house publication, they had an article about abandoned buildings, basically saying abandoned buildings are bad,
Hmm.
and they're not just bad in and of themselves, but the very presence of them
Yes.
spreads blight and creates more abandoned buildings and more destruction. So here they're saying abandoned buildings are very bad and fighting in court to defend abandoning the buildings.
Exactly. Well, it is. It all becomes just a cancer, and it just metastasizes over the entire neighborhood. You know.
Exactly.
So, and then
Exactly.
speaking of HUD, a name that came back to me just now when you reminded me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he was kind of a good guy in this. Was
Romney?
Romney, right?
I know.
He wanted to do good, but then again, the rest of the administration was like, "Take it easy, pal. You're stirring too much stuff up." That's kind of the feeling I got, in that they would rather sweep it all under the rug, the powers that be, rather than address the things that Romney knew, he was the head of HUD at the time, were going awry.
I was very sympathetic to Romney. I mean, he have done things differently, and I don't know. I don't want to second guess it. I saw as you started to say, he was in an impossible position when these civil rights acts passed. Johnson was the president, and the
Hmm.
Democrats were essentially in power. Though I don't think they controlled Congress and the Senate, but Johnson was an influential man. And then he decided not to run, and so he put these acts into place, but it was Richard Nixon and his administration that were responsible for implementing
Hmm.
these acts. And when things imploded, people were pointing fingers at him. So he didn't want to fix it. He wanted to just make it go away and blame someone else. And I
Yes.
tracked that too. And poor Romney, like when he was given the position of I think he was, I forget, he wasn't the first secretary for HUD, but he was in there in the beginning. He took it to heart. He had already, he had already battled, in, oh God, where he was governor to fight, housing discrimination. So he was on a mission. The act said, make it, a more affordable and easier for families of color and buy home. And he was also, part of that act was to build, I forget how many units of affordable housing,
Yes.
10 million, I want to say 10 million
Hmm.
units of affordable housing in a certain amount of time. And he was making very good progress with that.
Yes.
But that got stymied by Nixon. And instead of addressing the problems that, the criminals that were scamming these acts, he shut the acts down.
Yes.
And then instead of prosecuting the white collar criminals, and as street crime went up, they went over these people who were essentially victims. They were of what had been created by these white collar criminals. I don't know if that came out clear. I think it was kind of garbled, but yeah, I found, communications, in a professor named Christopher Bonastia wrote books about, uh, like, they're like parallel stories to the stories that I wrote in the Killing Fields. But he had uncovered all these communications between, Nixon and Romney and the people under Nixon, and just they were going to make Romney the scapegoat,
Sure. Yeah.
and every time Romney tried to do something good and worthwhile, they just crushed him.
Yeah. And now, for our listeners, just so that everybody knows who we're talking about, this isn't Mitt Romney, this is Mitt Romney's father.
Yeah, George Romney.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Because Mitt Romney's an old guy, but he's not that old.
he was a good and decent guy. When Tony started to discover how widespread this was, and that, it wasn't just mortgage bankers, it involved the government, it involved the FHA, who and this is a department that ran under Romney. So he needed to get people in the FHA so he could gather evidence of these crimes. He needed the cooperation. And he met with Romney. And he's a young guy. He's like, I think he was 28 at the time. And here
Yep.
he is meeting with George Romney, who had recently run for president, basically saying, I need to come in, I need to gather evidence, I need to talk to people, and you need to keep your mouth shut. You can't tell anyone. If you like tip them off that we're investigating this, they're going to hide all the evidence, they're going to
Yeah.
clam up. And he said Romney, understood completely and never told a soul except for the people that he gathered within HUD to help Tony.
Yeah, the whole book. I'm very happy that I came across it. I'm very happy that I read it, and I'm really happy that I'm talking to you right now. Let me let me ask you this now. This is it is a very, I guess I'll say dense book. There's a lot of information in here. How long did it take you to do all this research?
That actually, normally it takes me about 4 or 5 years to write a book. I'll research for a couple of years and then write for a couple of years.
Hmm.
And I essentially finished this book in a year and a half. And
Oh, so you did it rather quickly.
it was painful. It was really painful because I had to do the same amount of research in half the amount of time because I didn't want it to be a poorly researched book. I wanted it to
Hmm.
be thoroughly, I wanted to make a point and I wanted to make it well. I didn't want to leave any room for people to argue about the points that I was making, like, oh, you left out this, you didn't talk to this person. And like normally when finish a book, I have an idea in my head what book I'm going to write next. And this happened, my last book finished and my ideas came during the pandemic.
Hmm.
And so all during the pandemic, I was like just frustrated that I couldn't really conduct the research because all the areas, like the archives that I would visit to do this research, were shut down.
Yep.
So when I finally got to the point where I had a contract and places to go, there was like I had to finish it within a year and a half, based on
Hmm.
this contract. So it was painful because I wanted to do a good job. So like I went to an archives at Cornell. Like I write about this guy Walter Thabit, who had been hired by the city of New York to research East New York and come out with a plan to build affordable housing in East New York.
Hmm.
And so his archives are all in Cornell. And so I wrote them, set up an appointment, told them all the boxes, like you can go through archives and see what's in boxes and decide which boxes you want to see. Got all those boxes ready. And when I went there, I had my phone, which has a scanner on it, and I was just literally like this: paper scan, paper scan, paper scan,
Yeah.
hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I went through in a day,
Yeah.
which I normally would have spent maybe weeks.
Yeah.
And I was done at the end of the day. And then I realized normally when you're a researcher, you note every single piece of paper, exactly where you got it, the number of the box and
Hmm.
the number of the folder. I mean, everything. So if anybody wants to check your research, they know exactly where to go. And I realized I had gone through it so fast that I never
You
wrote
didn't write it all
down the
down.
folder number. In most cases, I did have the box number, and normally I have all these sources in the back of the book, but it's missing folder numbers, things like that.
Yeah.
And I just
Yeah.
said, "Oh my God, people are just going to jump on me for that." But too bad. I
Yeah.
mean, that those are the circumstances, and it's not like I made everything up. I've got copies of everything,
And how many personal interviews were you able to conduct with this?
hundreds. I would
Hundreds.
have liked to have done
Hundreds.
hundreds more, to tell you
Wow.
the truth. When the book came out, all sorts of people, reached out to me with East New York
After the fact,
stories.
of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would have loved to included them. And I'm starting to go through and talk to all of them because when the paperback comes out, I might be able to slip some things, small things
Yeah.
into the paperback. But also I had to deal with the problem that people didn't want to talk to me. Uh, which I was not used to. Like, for instance, when I wrote my cold case book, I had to speak to families of unsolved murder victims, and always like was terrified the first time I called them because
Of course.
I don't want to open up these wounds.
Hmm.
But in every case in that book, everyone wanted to talk to me. And it was because in their mind, if I talk to her and she includes this in her book, maybe something will happen and
Yeah.
my daughter's case will be solved. In East New York, it was the exact opposite. For the most part, no one wanted to talk to
Yep.
me. And I didn't understand why. Like, I understand why they don't want to talk to the police, but why not me? And then I learned, I was able to track down someone who witnessed the murder that I had written about, that I featured in the book. It opens with the murder of
Yes.
a 17-year-old girl, Julia Parker, and I found a witness to her murder. And so I'm talking to him, and he was great. He told me, he gave me a lot of information about life in East New York. And he said, "Oh, you should talk to this person, this person." And I brought up the fact that I was having trouble getting people willing to talk to me. And he says, "Oh, I know someone great for you to talk to." And he calls up this guy, and it's on speakerphone. And he starts talking to him. And the guy didn't know that I was, on that call.
Hmm.
And he's like, "I'm not going to talk to her. If you want to talk to her, you can talk to her." And I forget what he said exactly, but it was very clear that journalists to him were no different than the police, and I
Yep.
was the bad guys.
Yep.
And I thought, well, that makes sense. We never covered your murders when they happened, so yeah.
Well then, and I can attest to that on my side when you as a journalist are having trouble getting something out of the police. Because, and this is not an attack on journalism in any way, it's just a fact that I've probably been in the paper at least a dozen times, okay? Both as a policeman and then, other things that have happened in my life, whatever. I can name probably a dozen times where I've either been in the newspaper myself and or attached to a case or a situation that was in a newspaper. Never once has it been correct. Not that the story, the main thread of the story, yes, something happened and this is what happened, but the facts get mixed up and you can't help it because it's so hard. If you have five, it's like the old game of telephone. You know, it's always hearsay, and then you have five different sources, and each one tells you a different story. Well, what are you going to write? And I could say, well, I was standing right there, so I know, and or I also did the investigation, and it came out this way. But I could see how people would immediately be jaded, especially after going through. I have no idea how old this gentleman was, but being 60, 70 years old and going through all of it himself and being let down by every police officer and everything he ever saw on the news was a lie or wrong or whatever. I'm not talking to nobody. I get it, you
I
know.
get it too. When I heard him, I did understand it from his point of view.
Yeah.
But fortunately, I got enough people to talk to. I work a couple of days a week at the ASPCA,
Hmm.
and a few people that I work with grew up in East
Which
New
happens to
York.
be on the block that I grew up on.
Oh, really?
We had an apartment, okay, where
I
the
think this came up when we were emailing.
where the Marriott now stand. I think it's a Marriott. There's a hotel that's right next to the ASPCA,
Except now
closer to First Avenue.
yeah, but I don't think it's a hotel any longer.
Oh, okay. I don't
But
know.
anyway, go ahead. But I
Right
think
across the street from the projects, there was a hotel there. The building that used to be there, we had an apartment in, and there used to be a car wash on the corner, and all of that's gone now because it's all torn down and built up. And the windows of our apartment look down over the car wash back then, so I know it well. I know it well. So
so. I was able to get enough stories. And by the way, about like I know, like when you were saying five different people, five different versions, like I've dealt with that.
oh yes,
Wow.
yes.
So all I can say is I give the different versions. Like he
Hmm.
said this happened, he said this happened.
Yes.
And with this book, I fact checked it thoroughly, like which is not to say someone's not going to find something incorrect. It's like you can spend months and months and months and months and months and
Sure.
still
Oh
miss
no,
them.
it's impossible.
But for every person that was in the book, I called them and told them what I wrote and said,
Yeah.
"Tell me what I got wrong, and we'll fix it." And it was all little things, but I
Well,
went
again,
over everything to make sure.
I thought you did a beautiful job, Stacy. I really enjoyed this book. It
Thank you.
it pulled me right through. And being an author, you know what I'm talking about. When you can read a book and you can enjoy it, but I wanted to put it on every day, because I wanted, oh, like I said, I was listening in the car and I'd park. I got to turn it off now. You know, I wanted to get pulled through, and it did. It pulled me right through.
I was a little bit worried because the 7-5, there was like, I couldn't not tell some of the things that went on there.
Oh well, the seven
Michael
five is.
Dowd and
Did you watch? Did you watch the documentary, the seven
yeah,
five? Yeah, excellent documentary. Okay, and you know, again, it's a black eye on the New York City Police Department, but as the Mullen Commission itself said afterwards, you know, less than 1% of the New York City Police Department is corrupt. Unfortunately, back then, we had like 38,000 guys. So, that means, you got almost 3,000 guys running around doing the wrong thing. It's way too many, you know? And nobody hates a corrupt cop more than a good cop. I'll tell you that right now. So, but that's something that, that's part of the fabric of that neighborhood, man. It was part of what put it together. And I might add too, back to what we were saying before about the degradation of neighborhoods, it degrades everything because you have somebody like this idiot Dowd, and I can't remember his partner's name. Who were the two main bad guys of that? What were they? What are they called? The Reservoir Dogs or the Reservoir Boys or something like that was
I don't know. And it
their
wasn't
name.
just the two of them, there was more than
There
two.
was more, but there were the two main guys. Then
Yes.
they had their friends. But you know, had the place that they landed not been so completely upside down and impossible, would they have turned bad? I like to think either it's in you when you're born. That's what you get from mom and dad. You don't corruption or thievery or violence. It's in you or it's not. You know, and for the main characters there, I think it was part of their makeup, so to speak. But had they been working someplace nicer, would they have gone as far as they did? Possibly
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
because it's all they see. All they see is the worst of society and the worst of humanity. And again, not because I firmly believe that everybody everywhere around the world, the vast majority of people are decent people. You know, it's just that with poverty, you have more desperate people, and therefore you end up with, for lack of a better word, more assholes who take advantage of whatever they need to take advantage of society. And again, it degrades society that much more. And that's why bad neighborhoods are bad. But in this case, caused by these filthy white collar bastards who you know, created and destroyed this once beautiful neighborhood of East New York.
Yeah, I call my book a victim statement. They let the victims of crime make a statement in court, and this is my victim statement for the neighborhood of East New York. But by the way, Dowd definitely is a bad guy. Like I've watched recent interviews of him, and he just revels in the attention. And even
Oh
though he
yes, yes.
says this is wrong, he's having a great time.
Well, you see that with every you know uh, ex gangster now has got his own podcast or TV show. Well, what do you call these TV shows now when it's true life? I don't know what they're called.
Reality.
Reality. There you go. Reality TV show. You have Sammy Bull Gravano, who, murdered 18 people. Granted, they might have all been other gangsters. I don't care. You're still a murderer. How
Yeah.
in the world do you have your own television show?
Yeah.
He's a hero. Songs are written about him. Literally, there's rock and roll songs written about Sammy Bull Gravano, which is just crazy to me. You know,
Yeah, and they say, "Oh, I'm doing this so to show the error of my way, so young people don't,
he's doing it
follow in
for a
my
paycheck.
footsteps." They
Yeah.
and for the fame. I
Yes.
don't see any real remorse in Michael Dowd at all.
No. No. So, and it's a shame. But Stacy, is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I think we did a good talk here.
I
What I want to ask you. I've enjoyed talking to you so much. I'd like to ask you to come back if you would.
I'd love to.
And um, of the books that you've done, I'm very interested in the Cold Case book, which unfortunately I can't remember the name of it now.
The Restless Sleep,
The Restless Sleep, and the other
Blackwell's
one
Island.
on Roosevelt Island. Which
That's
one?
Damnation Island.
Which one do you want me to read for our next meeting?
Well, if you're a history buff, Damnation Island.
Damnation. Well, I'm going
But
to read both of them. Tell me which one you want me to read first.
it doesn't matter. I think you might enjoy The Restless Sleep more
Okay.
because it's police history. I
Yeah.
talk about the formation of the squad. I actually used material from The Restless Sleep in the Killing Fields because I talked about how, in response to thousands of unsolved murders, the police department did finally establish a cold case squad, but there was resistance. I mean, a tremendous amount of resistance at first, and now the cold case squad is just remnants of what they once were. There's just a few guys, and they
Well,
don't
from
get.
what I understand, even at its height, it was only like 50 guys, and now it's probably 15 or 20, if that.
Oh, I think it's like 10 or 12
10 or
now.
12 now. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, people don't realize another thing that people just don't realize now, and I don't want to get in again back into the craziness of politics and where we're working now, but I just mentioned back in my time, we were about 38, there was about 38,000 police officers in New York City. Okay. And through attrition and through nobody taking the job and all of the anti-police movements that have defund the policing, et cetera, that's going on, and the way culture has changed, I believe they're down to like 26,000, and they're afraid through how many people are leaving that they may dip below 25,000, which is scary, scary. Because I'll tell you right now, even at our height at 38,000, in the precincts, the neighborhoods that I worked, we didn't have nearly enough guys.
Yeah.
You know, you never have enough manpower to put enough people in the cars to answer the calls for the victims that need them because they call, and you can't get there quick enough, and there's just not enough people to do the job. It's a very very scary thing, and I think right now it's very scary, and I think unfortunately we're going to see in about 5 years time, you know, the ramifications of what's happening now, if that makes sense to you. Where you're not going to have any seasoned police officers or detectives who know how to do the job anymore, because it's the older guys that teach the younger guys, the younger
Yeah.
people, how to truly do it.
Yeah.
It's the good guys, the guys who don't leave after 20, the guys
Yeah.
that stay for 25, 30, 35
Yeah.
years because it's in their heart to do it. And that's who you learn from. You don't learn nothing in a police academy. They don't teach you anything. You learn from the older guys who have the experience, and there's not going to be any left, you know?
I just thought of a book you have to read that I want to read as well. There's a guy named Peter Moskos. I may be pronouncing that wrong. Moskos. He's a professor at John Jay, and he's an ex-cop himself. And he wrote a book called On the Brink about the history of the Comstat process
Mm-hmm.
and how it brought us back from the brink. The Comstat fascinates me. I wrote about it just a little bit in The Restless Sleep and a little bit in this book. I have mixed feelings about it. Obviously, it did a lot of really great things, but I believe it also did bad things. But I'm not an expert on Comstat by any means, but he is, and I'm dying to read this book to see what he learned. And I think
Oh,
you would enjoy it too.
I'm already going to be looking it up. I just wrote it down. I'm going to look it up and
It's
definitely check it out.
because based on what I know about how that started and the people involved and the politics, which were, you know, it fascinates me.
Yes. Yeah.
And police culture at the time, it's a great story. It's just what I know, and I don't know a lot, so I'm dying to hear the whole story.
Oh, so it looks like you might have another book in you right there. So.
No, he just wrote it.
Oh,
That's what I'm saying. I'm going to read his book.
you have your own take on it, though. We'll see. We'll see. All right. Well, thank you so much, Stacy. For everybody, please, The Killing Fields of East New York. I highly recommend this one. It's a good read. It's full of true crime. It's full of history. It's an excellent read. Do yourselves a favor. Pick it up right away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Stacy, until next time, all the best.
You too.
All right. Well, there you have it. Stacy Horn. Do yourselves a favor. I know I said it before, and you just listened to this episode anyway, but pick yourself up a copy of The Killing Fields of East New York. She did a great job with this book. I really enjoyed it. Heartbreaking stuff. If you're a true crime fan, this is true crime. Okay? But it's written in a way that's very easy to read. It's got a nice novelistic edge to it. and I highly recommend it. And I myself am going to pick up one of her other books so we can have her back in a few weeks. That's it. Once again, thank you so much for listening. Do the right thing now. Do the right thing. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and please, if you want to watch this instead of listen, go to For Boston's Media on YouTube and or on Rumble. For Boston's Media channel. All right? You'll see all of these podcasts, plus all the silly little shorts and other things that I do. That's it. Until next time, my friends. Thanks for listening. All the best. Listen up. This one's important. I'd like to try to encourage you, please, to give to the Stephen Siller Foundation, Tunnel to Towers, at T2T.org. That's letter T, number 2, letter T.org. Do good for those who've done good for you.